vibe I'm going for is caffeinated. This is Zuzu. I am Crew. Me showing you my dog, this dog, tells you something about me. Zuzu's fluffy. Look how fluffy she is. Tells you I like fluffy dogs. Zuzu is small, so you assume I like small dogs. Your assumption there would also be correct. Focus on the dog. Let's just look at the dog. New piece of information. I live in university housing. That new piece of information, combined with what you already know about me, knowing that I have a dog, that she's very fluffy, leads you to assume something new about me. That leads you to a new conclusion about me. That leads you to technically one of two conclusions. Either, based on the assumption, of course, that university housing tends not to allow animals, either I experience a disability of some kind, and Zuzu is a service animal, or I have her in direct violation of my contract. Neither of those is exactly an idyllic scenario. Look at how cute she is. Look at her little pants. I'm confusing your narrative of what you would expect someone who has a dog to be like. When you think of, a dog and someone who has a dog, it's probably like a family, A family maybe with kids, maybe just young people, happy, loving their dog, having fun with their dog. It's a border collie. Maybe you think outdoorsy type. I'm not that outdoorsy. I'm confusing your assumptions of what you thought based on seeing my dog. You also know that I don't live some idyllic life, because you know that I either live with a disability or I live in the fear that I'm either going to have to someday get rid of her or be evicted from my apartment for having a dog, which is not great, to say the least. Here's the thing. You know from the title of this video that it's not about dogs. It's about Arthuriana. So, why do I have her? Well, how is she connected to it? She's not. What I just did with Zuzu is what Tales of Zestiria does with Arthuriana. Arthuriana is the term that I'm going to use to encompass all of the different manuscripts, primary historical documents, secondary historical documents, adaptations, and in general the cultural heritage, quote unquote, of the legend of King Arthur. That cultural heritage is, of course, complicated. Tales of Zestiria uses the trappings of Arthurian as a sort of symbol, as a touchstone that an audience can latch onto, especially a Western audience. I mean, the sword and the stone, right? The sword and the stone is something that a Western audience would be very familiar with. And I use the term Western here, of course, carefully. The idea of Western culture, in air quotes, is very much a white supremacist concept. I mean, used to promote usually white culture from predominantly white areas over the culture and heritage of other areas. I am aware that the term Western culture is used in a way that's often a dog whistle for white supremacy, and saying, if you say something about Western culture being superior, that's a coded phrase for white supremacy. Now, the thing is that my usage of that term is actually intentional, because there is an interesting connection here to white supremacy. But we'll get to that in a minute. I say the Western audience. Specifically, I'm highlighting the Western audience because Tales of Zestiria was published by Namco Bandai in 2015 for the PS3. And it was written, directed, developed, published in Japan initially. And so it's interesting that this piece of art, this game, is pulling very heavily from what we would term Western culture, with all of the white supremacist baggage that word contains. Specifically pulling from Arthuriana, which is very much one of the foundational myths of quote-unquote Western culture, especially British and English-speaking culture. It's kind of a common history and backstory and legend formation for much of the English-speaking world. The interesting thing, though, is that the elements of Arthuriana and Tales of Zestiria end up not actually meaning that much to the story, which you could argue is a form of cultural appropriation, the bad kind where you borrow an element from someone else's culture only to advance your own culture and kind of incorporate it into your own culture without really giving credit. That's kind of what differentiates honoring a culture from cultural appropriation. It's kind of the substance there in the context, but Tales of Zestiria doesn't really do a whole lot with the elements of Arthuriana. What it does is it uses them to advance its own narrative, and that's really interesting to me. It actually puts Zestiria in a really kind of awkward place in terms of where it fits into a cultural and literary narrative. For one thing, the cross-cultural interaction of Arthuriana in Japan is actually a long and storied history, one that we will get into. And so you could even argue that a Japanese studio using Arthuriana is, in a way, not borrowing from another culture because it's being incorporated into their own culture from many, many years of it being very predominantly taught in schools and brought over by people like missionaries and colonists. The problem is, though, I think that Namco Bandai, using these trappings of Arthuriana, as kind of an attention grabber, is emblematic of and shows some of the ways that white supremacy works in media, and it kind of works exactly the way that Namco Bandai would probably want it to be working. We'll get into that. I think a context on Japanese academia's relationship to and interest in Arthuriana is really relevant. Most of the Japanese interaction with and contact with Arthuriana comes via Malory's Morte Arthur, which is a very long Arthurian text that is great, but also about 1,500 pages long. So if you have that kind of time, it's worth reading, but I don't have that kind of time. So, a Japanese scholar named Masako Tagaki discusses the interactions with Morte Arthur in terms of Japanese academia and Japanese culture at large. Quote, "After the Edo period came to an end in 1868, the Meiji Restoration began, bringing many rapid and fundamental changes to Japan. In the field of literature, the movement to introduce and translate Western works began on account of the urgent need to catch up with Western civilization and establish it in Japan." To pause there, I think the idea of needing to catch up with another civilization is a supremacist phrasing that's putting, this civilization is quote-unquote more advanced than another. It's problematic. We don't really have time to get into it here. Japan had almost no exposure to the West until then because of Sakoku, the isolationist policy which banned most Westerners from entering Japan except for the Dutch. When the black ships from North America arrived, the Japanese government was left with no other option but to open its ports to the United States. Vigorous new attempts to improve the art of translation from European languages, particularly English into Japanese, began to be made. Many schools which had taught Dutch changed their language to English. It also meant that the Japanese language was obliged to change. It is symbolic that many new words which express modern Western concepts were coined after the influx of Anglophone Westernization. With this urge to acquire Western civilization, the curious Japanese audience reached out for, embraced, and enjoyed extraordinary stories from the West. In this atmosphere, Malory's Morte Arthur was introduced by foreign instructors hired by the Japanese government to teach Western culture into literature and language classes at a very young age. Its popularity then grew on its own with various translation attempts. So the Japanese interaction with Arthuriana isn't happening the same way in Japan as it does in England and in the United States, Canada, the rest of the English-speaking world. In those areas, Arthuriana is a very complicated intersection of many different texts, ranging from Welsh fragmentary manuscripts to huge epic poems to even modern adaptations. Japanese interaction with Arthuriana happens almost exclusively through Morte Arthur. Of course, Malory's text is a complicated interaction between many different source texts, different manuscripts, different things Malory's pulling from to produce his text. The details of how exactly Malory is combining all these texts aren't super relevant to this episode. If that's something that interests you, I've included some citations in the description. These essays go into the complicated history details of Malory's construction of his work. It's important to note, as C. Scott Littleton does, that Japanese culture has its own Arthurian-esque figures in its folklore and history, though I would note here that calling them Arthurian, as Littleton does, is a little bit problematic just because That assumes that the King Arthur myth is the default, and that anything that could be construed as similar to it is emulating it, so emulating what is part of the English-speaking world, and that's just another form that white supremacy takes in terms of establishing itself as the default in our narratives surrounding culture, surrounding literature and history. However, the details that Zestiria draws the most from are from Malory's account. And I guess for disclosure, I'm going to mention that this video is only going to cover about the first fifth of the game, so no major spoilers ahead. The game is brilliant. I highly recommend playing it. Super fun to explore, great open world, really good level design. So if it's a game that interests you, I encourage you to play it, and you're not going to find any spoilers here. The interesting thing is that in order to kind of do a holistic discussion on Arthurian elements in the game, only about the first fifth of the game is necessary to discuss, which is something really interesting that we're going to get into. We always get into the interesting stuff here, the weird stuff. Now, the game opens with this goofball character kind of deal, Saray. I always thought it was Sorry because I played with the volume off for the first little bit and was reading the text, and I read Sorry, so I was like, oh, cool, yeah, sorry. And then I listened to the voice acting, and it was like, Saray, and I was like, ooh, I'm saying that wrong. So if I say it wrong, that's why. Saray and his seraph buddy Mikleo are exploring some ruins. I guess they're doing research, but they're not exactly being that careful in terms of contaminating paleographic and historical samples. While exploring these ruins, Saray learns of this mythical hero called the Shepherd, who will return after a long time away to vanquish evil. It's a trope we've seen 1,000 times. It's King Arthur. You know, like the topic of this video. Like the one that's in the title. But the big one, the huge Arthur moment, the huge Arthuriana moment, is the drawing of the sword from the stone. That's a symbol that virtually anyone who's heard of King Arthur is familiar with. The Legend of the Sword and the Stone, like the Disney movie, which you've maybe heard of, which is based on T.H. White's book, The Once and Future King, brilliant book, which is based on Morte d'Arthur, where that idea of a sword being drawn from a stone comes from. Even more on the nose is that the sword, the stone with the sword in it, is found in the town of Lady Lake, in the sanctuary of the Lady of the Lake. If you're familiar with Arthuriana, that's going to ring some bells. The Lady of the Lake is a figure in the Arthurian myth who ends up giving Arthur Excalibur. In many modern retellings of the Arthurian myth, the sword and the stone, which is not usually Excalibur, and then Excalibur, the legendary sword that will vanquish evil, yada yada yada, they're kind of conflated into one, which is a little bit what's happening here in Zestiria, using this imagery and this idea of the Lady in the Lake being the one who cedes the sword to Saray. Yeah, spoiler alert, Saray draws the sword. Right, come on. We saw that coming a million miles away. Wouldn't you know it? Helpless Saray, the silly goofball, is the one destined to draw the sword from the stone and become the shepherd who will save the world. Chosen one trope. We've seen it a billion times. At least Saray's an interesting character, unlike some other chosen ones that are not really that interesting of characters. I will be awaiting you in the comments. In this case, the act of pulling the sword from the stone is symbolic, as it is in many other parts of Arthuriana. It marks him as the chosen one in the eyes of the people. Sorry doesn't even specifically wield the sword that's in the stone. He bonds with the spirit of the Lady of the Lake, Lila, who grants him powers, including this dope frickin' sword, to vanquish evil. The interactions with Arthuriana, besides some trite names borrowed from Arthuriana, like the ruins of Galahad, end there. Like, entirely. The game doesn't borrow plot beats from the Arthurian legends. It doesn't borrow many stylistic elements from Arthuriana. It's really interesting that the pulling of the sword from the stone and the idea of a hero returning after a long time away are the extent to which the game is interacting with Arthuriana. And it's really interesting that the actual sword that is pulled from the stone doesn't end up mattering. Even the idea of an Excalibur doesn't end up being the case. In terms of the game's combat systems, the sword is not like a specific item that gets equipped so much as it is just an extension of Lila's power. So it kind of subverts this idea of Excalibur. The game doesn't really go into any of the themes that are explored in Arthurian text through the Sword and the Stone, like who gets to decide who's king. That's kind of the main idea that gets explored when you are talking about this legend of pulling a sword from a stone makes someone king, right? Well, why? Who gets to pull it from the stone? Who gets to try? Those are the questions that Arthurian is asking about it. Zestiria doesn't care about those questions, and that's not a bad thing. It's just interesting that they borrow so overtly from Arthuriana in this one element and don't end up exploring any of the same questions that Arthuriana explores with the element. I think Arthuriana's inclusion in Tales of Zestiria is actually partially at least due to sales and marketing forces. And that's not saying that the developers were sellouts and they only included it to try and drive sales. It has an incredible story. It's just not a story about Arthuriana. It's likely that some, if not all of the connections and conclusions, hypotheses that I'm going to posit here are entirely coincidental, if they're even true. That's the point of making an argument. It might not be true. But even if they weren't intentional, they're there. The fact that Arthuriana is in the game is indisputable. What that means for the game, what that means for us as we interact with it, is what is, at least for this channel, what's interesting. Being able to look at our entertainment critically is really an essential part of being a good consumer and not being sold hot piles of garbage over and over again. That's what's kind of at stake here in this discussion of what Zestiria is indebted to and what it's doing with those references. My hypothesis is that the elements of Arthuriana that are included in Tales of Zestiria are primarily included for a Western audience. Again, Western with all of the weight that word has. I think they were included to try and make the game a greater success in Europe and North America, in regions outside of Asia, than the Tales series had been thus far. Around the turn of the century, the Tales games were really successful in Japan, but they had been struggling to find success outside of Japan. Not just because many times they weren't translated out of Japanese. However, the GameCube's Tales of Symphonia was actually pretty successful. To this day, it remains the best-selling Tales game. Tales of Vesperia, which followed it up in North American markets, was also pretty successful. However, they weren't quite as successful as the huge success that the series was seeing regularly in Japan up until that point. The moderate success that these games were seeing outside of Japan were probably not what Namco Bandai was expecting in terms of, other franchises that they had, like Dark Souls, that were doing incredibly well out of Japan, or even The Legend of Zelda, the most famous Japanese role-playing series of all time. They probably wanted that level of success. So I posit that in order to make Tales of Zestiria more successful and appealing to markets outside of Japan, these elements of Arthuriana were included to cater to what those audiences may be expecting and wanting out of the narrative functions of the game. What the Arthurian elements in Zestiria do is give the audience a familiar point, something that they know, and they're like, okay, I know what that is. I can connect with that. I know whoever pulls the sword from the stone is the chosen one, right? That's a tale you know. And so when you see a sword in the stone in Tales of Zestiria, you're like, oh my gosh, someone's going to pull that from the stone, and then they're going to be the chosen one. And it's probably Soray. But I'm going to stick around and keep playing because I want to know what happens next. And that's obviously what the game developers want you to do. They want you to stick around and keep playing. If you stick around and keep playing, you end up invested in a narrative as well as in gameplay and story structures that vary pretty wildly from quote-unquote traditional Western forms of expression. Why exactly would this work, especially with how overt the game is with the fact that, oh, there's a sword in the stone, it's Arthuriana, and then it ends up not really being a big thing in the game, and Arthuriana is really just kind of window dressing. Why does that still manage to work? I mean, the game was really successful. It comes down to the way in which the quote-unquote Western world has tended to interact with culture, with entertainment, with media. Western society, which again is a white supremacist construct, but one that is important here, has been trained by history to really only interact with cultural artifacts out of Western society, quote unquote. Because of colonialism, English and European literature was spread across the globe, and it was often placed in a cultural position of superiority because of the white supremacy that was taking place in areas that were colonized. And so it was viewed that English and other European texts, but mostly English texts, were placed as superior to indigenous texts from the areas that were colonized. If you want to know more about colonialism, I've put a couple links in the description where you can learn a little more about it. It's a really long, complicated history that we do not have time for here. Because of this, literature from non-European cultures, read white cultures, so like North American, Australian, Canadian, and especially British culture. These works have been suppressed throughout history. Think back to your schooling days. How many books/things did you read that weren't originally written in English? That number is probably pretty low. For me, it was, definitely. In the quote-unquote Western world, we are raised up and trained to basically only interact with elements of the Western world, with elements of other cultures being subject to fetishization of the exotic, or just kind of as a token, here's our diversity day thing, which was an actual thing at my school, our diversity unit. Sometimes they just get skipped entirely, and Western audiences are entirely unfamiliar with many very important cultural artifacts from outside of the Western, mostly English-speaking world. So my hypothesis is that the developers of Tales of Zestiria lean into this. Whether that's consciously or unconsciously is kind of beside the point, but probably unconsciously. They used elements of Western culture, like Arthuriana, to appeal to a Western audience to try and inspire more sales success outside of Japan. They wanted to appeal to the audience and give them a cultural reason to become and stay interested in the game. And it worked. I think it worked. The game was pretty successful, and as of this year is actually the 4th best-selling game in the Tales series worldwide. It's also propelled the success of more recent games in the series, like Tales of Berseria. The cool thing I see about this is that Zestiria ends up telling a story that's very rooted in the traditions and storytelling structures of Japanese anime. Specifically, how it does that is a topic for another video. Certainly, if that's a video you want to see, let me know in the comments. And for me, at least, how I see that is that it's actually doing what Arthuriana is doing with its Arthurian elements. The Arthurian stories Arthuriana at large is not really interested in swords and stones and ladies and lakes. It's telling stories about what chivalry means, what sovereignty means, who should get to be king, what the responsibility of a king is. Those are the real stories at stake in Arthuriana. Tales of Zestiria is kind of doing that with Arthuriana. It's using these window dressing things that let the reader know, hey, this is Arthuriana, but actually telling a completely different story. A famous example of this in Arthuriana is T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is just a discussion of World War I and World War II. I mean, it's Arthuriana, but it's not about King Arthur. It's about World War I and World War II. So, basically, Tales of Zestiria ends up using these white supremacist assumptions and power structures in the world that Western audiences are going to be more likely to engage with a work that is pulling from their cultural heritage. Although that is a white supremacist notion, it actually ends up making this Japanese game incredibly successful outside of Japan. Zestiria sparked new interest in the Tales series. However, the question that then came to my mind is, what is this doing in Japan, right? What is using these white supremacist structures and assumptions do to the game in Japan, where it's from? Zestiria doesn't even crack the top 10 best-selling games in the Tales series in Japan. Most of the recent entries haven't cracked that list because of how much they've tried to appeal to Western audiences. What this shows me, at least, is that the series was hugely successful in Japan and very much rooted in Japanese storytelling. And as the series tries to use these white supremacist notions and constructs to gain success outside of Japan, even as they're still using Japanese storytelling structures and ideas and ideologies, it makes them less successful because, well, I imagine the Japanese audience just sees them as pandering to Western audiences. Even though it's not in earnest an Arthurian tale, I can imagine that being kind of alienating for a Japanese audience. Even today, with the series' increased interest and success outside of Japan, it's still not selling as well as the series did in Japan around its heyday. So in a way, I mean, it's the lesson that is pretty easy to learn. What works for one region in terms of game development, in terms of culture in general, doesn't necessarily work for another. Tales of Zestiria is a really interesting case study in how using and interacting with cultural artifacts outside of your own culture can both be successful and backfire. And if you were waiting this whole time to see if I was going to end up tying it back to Zuzu somehow, that it was all going to tie together, it doesn't. Tales of Zestiria doesn't end up tying everything back to Arthurian myth. Arthuriana was used as a way to ease players into the storytelling and the gameplay mechanics of the game. Then it disappears, basically entirely. Thanks for watching. If I've forgotten something in the description that I promised would be linked there, please drop a comment, and I will fix that. I hope this video helped you think a little bit more critically about the entertainment you consume and what power structures and ideologies might be underlying assumptions of that entertainment. Until next time.